ஆங்கிலத்தில் பேச போகிறேன் அதற்காக உங்கள் மன்னிப்பு கேட்டுக்கொள்கிறேன். The reason I want to speak in English is partly because I want to highlight some of Chalapathi's very important contributions to the study of history. It involves certain concepts which I can explain best in English, so please do bear with me. We all know about Chalapathi's sort of great contributions to sort of the study of Tamil history, literature, bringing these diverse fields together, the extraordinary scope of his work, and so on. But I came to his work from a very different vantage point, not as someone who was primarily interested in the history of Tamil Nadu, although I am, as a Tamilian, of course, interested. But in a professional sense, that was not what my interest really was. And what I want to talk to you today about is why we need to see Chalapathi's work as a historian, not as someone who has just labored in a field where others have not, right? I mean, if you think about the study of Indian history, particularly modern India, tends to be highly sort of focused on Bengal, North India, Maharashtra to a certain extent. So there is a natural tendency to assume that there are not that many people working in South India. And of course, Chalapathi's contributions in that domain are very, very significant, as I'm sure will come out in the discussions over the next couple of days. But I think it is important to see his work in a much wider sort of framework. And that is what I want to really talk about. I think what Chalapathi has managed to achieve in his historical writings is not just to illuminate a world of sort of Tamil history and literature and culture which was not very well known, both in Tamil as well as in English sort of language, but he has also challenged some of the most important historical concepts that have come about in the writing of history in a global sense over the last 30 years or so. And in that sense, I think his contributions need to be placed firmly, squarely in the center of many of these most important debates about the nature of modern history. And I just want to talk about what Chalapathi's major contributions, which in my opinion in that direction are. And then I will close with some personal reflections. So the one book which I think, in a sense, that others have spoken about, in those days there was no coffee, and then I'll coffee illai, is a book which really sort of introduced the idea of a history of consumption to the study of South Asian history at a time when the concept really had not that many takers, right? So history of consumption as different from the history of production. So if you go back to many of the sort of old modes of, older modes of sort of writing Indian global history, particularly Marxist historiography, the emphasis was always on production. It was on the relations of productions, it was on the modes of production, which were the dominant ways of thinking about it, right? There were other historians who had already started using the concept of consumption. Particularly, there was a group of early modern European historians who had started telling us that demand for certain kinds of items and the consumption of those were the sort of major driver for the formation of modern capitalism, at least in the European context. But what Chalapathi does in this book is to creatively and somewhat brilliantly expand the concept of consumption itself. In the hands of a historian like Chalapathi, consumption ceases to be simply an economic phenomenon. It is no longer just about consumption of certain kinds of material goods, which then leads to certain impetus for production of various kinds, which then leads to larger social, economic transformations and so on. But consumption in his hand ranges from everything from coffee on the one side to new forms of literature on the other, right? And what he manages to do without sort of all the theoretical machinery that usually goes with these things is to show how to integrate a cultural and social history with the histories of consumption itself. And I think, that was the kind of move which Chalapathi repeatedly makes in his work, which is to take a given sort of construct, which usually comes from sort of context which most students of Indian history are not very familiar, because I must say that Indian historians are pretty sort of inward looking, right? I mean, the study of Indian history is kind of something of an insular affair. And Chalapathi takes these concepts and brilliantly opens up the conceptual terrain. And of course, the range of materials that he has brought to bear on these questions is incomparable. But as I said, the sort of larger contribution of trying to open up an area of inquiry and suggest that there is so many more things going on makes it really important. In fact, there is a friend of mine who teaches, who recently taught a course in his university in the United States, and which was actually a course about modern India. And the first reading for the first class was actually the essay on, the introductory essay from, in those days there was no coffee. He said people should read it because they should read it as a parable of democracy in India and how it comes to India, right? So that is the way people have read Chalapathi's work in so many different contexts and understood how to make sense of that. So that I think is one example that I'd like to sort of talk about. The other sort of dimension in which Chalapathi's work has really sort of opened up is in his sort of, the attempt to use the histories of print, publishing, reading as an integrated sort of a complex. And here again, he's very sort of modest and does not really push the sort of argument in quite the way that I'm going to. But the reality is that these arguments are once again quite central to the way that much of our thinking about the advent or the coming up of modernity or the modern age itself is there, right? So there is a very influential concept of print capitalism, which Benedict Anderson and others like Marshall McLuhan kind of put out. And there has been, at least among historians of Western Europe, a consistent tendency to suggest that print in some ways is at the forefront of capitalism because books were the first mass-produced commodity, right? So in a sense, the print sector gives you an entry into thinking about modernity in a way that many other traditional sectors and industries do not. And what Chalapathy does is to sort of look at the advent of print in a non-Western context and suggest how the sort of coming into being or the embrace of ideas of what we think of as the modern in these contexts mix timelines and temporalities in extraordinary ways, right? So, for instance, this book suggests that even as print culture was kind of taking on Tamil Nadu, the old Tamarapattirai and other things did retain their importance. There were other kinds of oral communications and forms which did. So, it's a very interesting point and a useful reminder that modernity is not a one-way street, and particularly in the non-Western context when we are thinking about these questions, I think Chalapathy has shown through very detailed historical work in some ways how we can think about these kinds of concepts. And again, I think these contributions of his scholarship will continue to shape the way that scholars in very other different domains continue to work. And again, Chalapathy is sort of drawn inspiration from sources that most normal Indian historians, right? I mean, most of us would have read one book by someone like Robert Darnton, The Great Cat Massacre, but Chalapathy has read pretty much every book of Darnton, right? And it is that ability to sort of appropriate frameworks from completely different domains to creatively sort of use them in a different context and bring to bear a very, very rich set of empirical materials, which I think makes his work not something which is just the work of a Tamil historian or of some kind of a more provincial approach to rethinking India in terms of its region, but I think speaks to some of the most central debates about the nature of modernity itself. And I think it's a testament to what he has accomplished already by the age of only 50, that his work is sort of recognized in this fashion. Let me just close by sort of saying that for myself personally, as someone who does not work in the areas in which Chalapathy works, his work has been extraordinarily influential. Interacting with him, reading his work, speaking to him, discussing my own work with him, I think has been possibly the most important thing which has happened to my own intellectual formation in the last decade or so. And I'd like to give you 3 examples. A few years ago, I put together a collection of essays by another very distinguished historian from Madras called Sarvapalli Gopal, who worked on issues which are sort of closer to my heart in terms of contemporary history, political history, and so on. And when the volume came out, Chalapathy sort of read it and then sent me an email saying, Srinath, Romanana Panirkinga, very good, well, it's all come out quite well. But you did not address one particular sort of major shortcoming or blind spot of Gopal's approach to thinking about history, which is that he doesn't have any concept of culture. Not in terms of saying that he's not interested in studying popular culture, but the idea that politics itself is a culturally constituted domain is something that is totally absent from his work. And to that extent, you have to concede that it is a very old-fashioned way of thinking about politics. And that was the sort of insight, which just in one email very politely stated, which then made me think about everything that I'd done in the past 3 years and said, yeah, absolutely. I think, that's his ability to sort of hit the nail on its head and then come up with that kind of a, critical insight. Let me give you sort of 2 more examples. There is a essay of Chalapathi's which I'm not sure is very well known. I don't know if there is a Tamil version of it. It is actually an essay on Tranquebar, the Danish colony of Tarangambadi, and the advent of print culture. I think you even edited that volume with your colleagues and so on. Again, I think it's an extraordinary sort of essay because just for the range of scholarship, but also because Chalapathi shows a solid grasp of what was the background of the missionaries who came from Denmark, what kind of cultural presuppositions that they brought to bear in dealing with societies of the subcontinent, and why and to what extent they were influential and things did not work out for them, and how the relationship of power mediates nevertheless these kinds of cultural interchange. And I think that to me was a very important template when I was thinking about some work that I was doing in connection with a book, with the last book that I published, which was about the role of American missionaries in other parts of India. And Chalapathi's emphasis on how print culture is kind of very closely tied up with the Protestant sort of missionary culture in the subcontinental context was to me a very fundamental insight. So it's in that way that even a very sort of small, obscure sort of place and the research that he has done kind of opens up a completely different area. And lastly, because we've just been speaking about Pudumai Pittan, I can't resist sort of mentioning this. Some years ago I was trying to sort of do some research in Chennai about the sort of impact of the Second World War on Chennai. During the war, Chennai city was evacuated because there were sort of some bombing events which happened, but more there was a scare. There was a sort of sense that something terrible is going to happen. So I came here, I pulled out some materials in the archives, I was looking at various kinds of things. Evacuation of Chennai had been ordered up and so on. And I, of course, had to sort of discuss this with Chalapathy to ask him, saying, please suggest to me what are the other kinds of records and so on that I can find. So Chalapathy gave me one, hard look, and he said, why don't you go and read this story by Pudumai Pittan? It's a short story called Pada Pada. And of course, it was there in the collection that he himself had edited. And it's a story that I will recommend everybody should read. Because once again, it captures what happened to this city in those few months in early 1942, when there was a genuine fear about Japanese invasion, in a way that no other historical source that I saw could capture. The vividness, the immediacy, what was the psychological sort of fear, that spasm, that pada pada, which was coursing through the population. I think only a source like that could have bought me. Left to myself, I would not even have known of its existence. And I think that is one more reason to be thankful for Chalapathi's extraordinary scholarship and his gift of friendship, that he constantly keeps giving us these insights and these extraordinary entry points into understanding our own past. So thank you very much and congratulations.